Mark Doty. What did I do during Moogfest? You see this Voyager behind me? Moog Music donated that to the Bob Moog Foundation. And why? So I could carry all 40 pounds of it around to some really amazing artists that performed at Moogfest and have them sign it. Why did I do this? Well, partially for the exercise, but primarily for the Indiegogo campaign that the Bob Moog Foundation is mounting. It's a $50,000 campaign which will allow the Bob Moog Foundation to expand their Hallmark educational program nationwide. If you go to Indiegogo, you'll be able to make a donation. And if you make a donation at the $25 level, you'll be entered into a raffle to win this Voyager. $25 for what is probably the most valuable Moog Voyager in the world. And why? Not only is it a great Moog Voyager, but on top of that, all of the artists that have signed it, incredible artists such as Brian Eno, Tangerine Dream, and even historical artists like Dick Hyman have signed this thing. It's really a rare combination of autographs that you're not going to see anywhere else, and especially not on a Voyager. So, in celebration of this great event, I'm going to show you a little bit about the Voyager. So this is the Moog Voyager. First, let's start off with the oscillators, which is always the best place to start. The cool thing about the Moog Voyager's oscillators is, first and foremost, the wave shape is not selectable. It is variable, which is to say there aren't notches here in the wave knob. It's freeform. You can choose among the various waveforms and move between them and listen to the waveform shape change. For example, let's start off with triangle and move to pulse wave. And that is a rare functionality for a synthesizer to have. It's happened before in Moog synthesizers. You might recognize this from the Micromoog. But it's super, super cool because you have basically more waveforms to choose from. And what's more, on the Voyager, as I'll show you later, this is modulatable. So that is an incredible, really rare and fun thing to have, is a modulatable wave shape. You have your standard octave control from 32 feet to 1 foot. And that's quite a spread. Then you can see, that spread. You have a 32 foot on one side and a 1 foot on the other. And of course, you have frequency control. And of course, for the third oscillator, you have the same three functionalities. We have sync between the first and second oscillator. And if you don't know what sync is when the second oscillator's waveform is forced to restart when the first oscillator's waveform restarts. And that's unimportant. What's important is the characteristic sound that you get when that happens, which is this. You have third oscillator to first oscillator frequency modulation, which is to say that the third oscillator modulates the first oscillator. And as you modulate the third oscillator with various modulation, I'm doing manual modulation by moving the frequency and the octave and the wave shape, but you get to do some pretty interesting and sometimes clangorous effects to the first oscillator. Of course, you can also use the third oscillator as a modulation source, like in the Mini Moog, which we control through the modulation buses, but we'll get to that in a bit. And to do that, the third oscillator, you can shut off the keyboard control. So if we turn off oscillator 1 and 2, the keyboard is triggering the oscillator, of course. Actually, it's not triggering the oscillator, but it's triggering the output. But it's no longer keyboard control, which means that if you're using it as a modulation source, the speed of its modulation is not changed by you playing various keys, which is what you want. Like on the Mini Moog, you can turn the third oscillator's frequency to sub-audio. So it can be used as a modulation source. So they kept the idea of the third oscillator as a modulation source by allowing you to use it in a low frequency manner straight off the control panel, as well as being able to disconnect it from the keyboard control. The mixer is just a standard mixer. You have control over which oscillators are on and which volume that those oscillators are set to. Also noise can be accessed here, which is convenient. On the Voyager, the noise is kind of a mixture between white and pink, or at least that's what Moog says. So you don't have the white and pink switch that you had on the Mini Moog, but you do have the ability to turn the noise on and control its volume in regard to everything else. The rest of these controls are pretty obvious. So that's the mixer section. You also have control over your external input. Whatever you're putting in the external input in the back, you have control over its volume and whether it's on or off. We haven't heard the filter yet, but here's what the filter sounds like. Very obviously a Moog ladder filter. Of course, we can turn up the resonance and get that sound. This resonance obviously goes into self-oscillation. I think that cool sound that we just heard that doesn't sound like standard resonance self-oscillation has to do with the spacing knob, which is what I'm going to address right now. Moog has set up their filter as either a dual low-pass filter or a high-pass and low-pass filter in series, which was an interesting choice, especially since you don't have control over the individual filters except through the spacing knob. When you have it set to the dual low-pass, the spacing knob changes the filter cutoff point for these two filters in stereo. So one filter has a different cutoff point than the other, and it creates some really interesting spacing effects. You can plainly hear two different filters' cutoff points being moved when the spacing is set in this way. When you have it set to the high-pass, low-pass setting, what you're doing is controlling what part of the signal that the high-pass and the low-pass filters are getting. Which makes it sort of a variable band pass, I guess. It's weird also to be demonstrating this and to keep putting my fingers on, for example, Terry Riley's signature. You have keyboard control amount. The good old-fashioned keyboard effect where lower on the keyboard is the filter cutoff is in a different position than higher. So the higher is brighter, the lower is darker. We have a filter envelope, a discrete, separate filter envelope. And unlike the Mini Moog, we have ADSR instead of just ADR. So that's really awesome. You control this. It has both positive envelope and negative envelope, which is excellent. Positive to the right and negative to the left. You also have your standard VCA envelope, which, unlike, again, the Mini Moog, this is ADSR, so you have more control over it. And you can also set it to keyboard, so the keyboard is triggering the VCA envelope, or you can set it to on, which allows you to go crazy and do whatever you need to the sound without having to press any keys, which is very convenient. Let's leap over to the LFO. First and foremost, it's pretty standard. You have rate control, and the rate is indicated by the light. You also have LFO sync, so it can be set to itself, which is nice, or MIDI. You can set it so it's triggered by the keyboard, or triggered by the envelope gate. So you have a lot more functionality for the LFO than you would have in a lot of synthesizers. The Mini Moog, for example, being as that the LFO was just an oscillator and you didn't have these sync controls. More important than the LFO on its own is the incredible modulation bus. Now, I'm a giant fan of the Micro Moog, so I'm always like drawing comparisons. The Micro Moog also had an awesome modulation bus, which this one is a lot more complicated, but it is reminiscent. You have the ability to choose the source of your modulation, the destination of your modulation, how that modulation is realized through the shaping, and then the amount. Now, it's kind of confusing, and this is one of the sad things about the Voyager, is this part is so fantastically powerful that it can't be realized very simply. The mod wheel bus is turned on by the mod wheel, and the amount controls the amount of that. The pedal on bus is controlled by the pedal if there is one plugged in. If there isn't, you can control the amount with the amount knob. So it's labeled pedal on, and that was confusing to me at first, but basically it's going to be just on, like the on says, and you control that amount with the amount. Let's go triangle wave to oscillator 2. Or square wave to oscillator 2. Now, you could also set this to pitch, and that would be all three oscillators at once. So basically, we're setting the source as the LFO output, the triangle wave or the square wave, and we're setting it to pitch, which is all of the pitches. Or we could just have it be oscillator 2, or oscillator 3, or we could send it to the filter. Turn up the amount so you can really hear that. Or to the wave shape of all three oscillators. And then you can send the source to control the speed of the LFO, which is a pretty awesome thing too. Or this also serves as a PGM function, which is something that you can program in the programmable part, which I'm not going to cover. But anyway, to demonstrate all of the different possible outcomes of this modulation bus would be fun, but very challenging time-wise, because as you can see, mathematically, all of the different sources of modulation you can have directed to all of the different destinations, plus the different shapings, plus the different amounts, plus how you control it with either the mod wheel or the amount knobs. It just... There is a massive amount of modulation, and also remember that you can use oscillator 3 as a modulation source. So when you have oscillator 3 as a source, it can be either as a source as an audible oscillator or as a modulation source, which just makes the possible modulation sources crazy out of control. The touchpad has 4 different functions. It has an X function, which goes across, a Y function, which goes up and down, a function to sense how much surface area is being touched, and just a general gate, which is how long you're touching it. And those 4 settings can be controlled up here in the digital realm, and I'm not going to go into them. But you have an incredible array of ways that you can control the sound using this touchpad by digitally setting those various functions, the X, Y, the gate, and the area. I think it's represented by an A. It's currently set to a relatively boring filter control, but you can do a huge amount of functionality with this. And lastly, there is this section. I have the Voyager currently set to just reflect what exists on the panel. But in here you have many, many presets, and you have a heck of a lot more functionality that you have access to control how the synthesizer works. As a vintage synthesizer player, I'm totally disinterested in this. But if you're a modern synthesizer player who just likes analog sound, there's a lot of opportunity for sound shaping in here. That is essentially a very basic rendering of this extremely complex and useful synthesizer. And last, you're going to ask me, does it sound like a mini Moog? And my answer to that is can, but doesn't.